and welcome to The Bigger Picture, a podcast brought to you by the School of Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Sciences at King's College London. I'm your host, Dr. Maggie Cooper. And in this introductory episode, I'm going to explain what this podcast is about with the help of Peter Cooper, my husband.
Well, this new podcast that's starting up is being hosted by Dr. Maggie Cooper, who's here with me right now. So, Maggie, why don't you tell us who you are, what your background is, where are you coming from when you start to host this new podcast?
Well, hi, I'm Maggie, and my main job is really working with radioactive drugs, which is kind of a bit of a strange thing to do. But the drugs that we work on, they're mainly looking at either diagnosing or staging of diseases like cancer. Also, we deal with other diseases, but this podcast is going to be specifically about cancer. And also using those radioactive drugs to treat cancer.
So what is the podcast trying to do?
Well, we thought it was really important to talk to patients who have had experience of having scans or treatment using radioactive drugs for their cancer, because sometimes as scientists we're kind of working in a little bit of a bubble, and we don't really get the full picture about what's going on with patients and what's important to them. And the podcast, as you know, is called The Bigger Picture because we want to see the bigger picture behind what we're doing. As part of the podcast, you'll hear from real people with experience of living with cancer.
I do quite a lot of panels, PPI involvement and that. And we call it Researchers' Bubble. And they come on and you can see they're within the bubble of whatever that research is.
But the upshot was that I lost 2 stone in a very short time. And my skin was in a terrible mess. It was like as if I had a heat rash all the time.
To be honest, I don't remember. There's an awful lot I don't remember. One thing I do remember is I can't watch Homes Under the Hammer anymore because they always had it on. They always had it on the TV in the waiting room.
The gynecologist came to see me in the MDU unit with the Macmillan nurse to say, "You have cancer tumours. We're keeping you in. And you're full of ascites, which I'd never heard of."
The chemotherapy was the bit that I really was dreading, because again, that's a huge thing. Surgery is surgery and that's it. But to have that, and the children were very, very anxious that I would have to have that, with the hair, all the sort of, that would have been that's very cancery, isn't it? Whereas they couldn't see the surgery. Do you know what I mean? I just looked the same.
But there's a second part to it, is that we also want patients and people going through the scans and the diagnosis to understand the bigger picture behind what goes into making those radiopharmaceutical tracers for diagnosing their cancer.
And we can formulate that with some other chemicals into these little pre-made kits that work a bit like a pot noodle.
You would have the opportunity to get the radiation to every single part of the overall cancer.
I mean, potentially it's treating areas that we don't even know exist yet because they're not big enough to see on a scan, but it'll still go there and give it a radiation dose.
How can people access this podcast then? How do they get hold of it?
Well, it's going to be available on all the normal podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Spotify, Stitcher, I don't know, all that ones.
All the general podcast distributors. So how frequent are these going to be? When can people look out for a new episode?
So the plan is to start the episodes in April, in the middle of April, and then have one each month after that. And each episode will really be focusing on a particular subject. So that might be, for example, breast cancer, sentinel lymph node imaging. It will be the focus of the first podcast. Or maybe prostate cancer or ovarian cancer, different types of cancers that we have some involvement in. Now, sometimes that involvement isn't specifically that we have a drug that will diagnose that type of cancer. It might be that we have a drug which helps with the staging and the planning of the treatment for that cancer. Or it might actually be a drug that's used to treat that cancer. Or sometimes it might be a drug where we are looking at how chemotherapy is going by looking at how the cancer has responded to treatment. So it's not always specifically about, say, diagnosis, but it's somewhere where we use radioactive drugs somewhere in the process.
So people will tune in if they have a specific interest. But do you think there's going to be something that's going to be of interest to the general public here? What do you think people could get out of it if they're just a general listener?
Well, the podcast is really aimed at people who may be going through that process of having diagnosis or treatment for cancer, because we think that the other people's experiences of cancer diagnosis can really help you understand, what you might be expecting, what you're going to anticipate happening when you go for a nuclear medicine scan or a PET scan to look at your cancer.
I was referred for a PET scan to Clarebridge, which was really very painless, It was a very easy scan, not like an MRI. It's silent. You just have to lie still for 40 minutes, but apart from that, it's not difficult. And the only thing is that you couldn't go down and sit anywhere you wanted. You had to stay away from people under 18 and pregnant women. So I was looking around, God, I better not sit beside any of these women, because apparently I'm radioactive for about 8 hours afterwards.
So there's that side of it to help inform and to help people understand what they're likely to what's likely to happen to them. But I think that from the other point of view, even if you're not specifically a patient who's going through that experience right now, just generally speaking, we're going to highlight some of the interesting research that we're doing within our department. So I'm going to be speaking both to patients and to scientists who are involved in this research. So I think that people will find it very interesting to see what developments there are, what projects that we're working on, and how we're improving outcomes for patients.
Now, one of the features of this particular podcast is you're dealing with people who have diseases that are terrifying to some people, and they are fatal in some cases. So, do you think that this podcast is going to give some hope to people? Is this going to give encouragement to people when they see the developments that are being made?
Definitely, I would say, some of the progress that's been made in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is amazing. In one of the interviews, I talked to a guy who had prostate cancer, and we've got a new drug for helping to stage that, and we've got drugs which are being used to treat that, which simply weren't available 5 or 10 years ago. So there's terrific progress in this area, and we see that there are far more people are surviving cancer. So we have not cancer patients so much as cancer survivors out there, and it's just tremendous. And also we can benefit from improved quality of life, which is also important. Another thing I think the podcast will highlight is some of the signs and symptoms to look out for people who may not realise they have cancer. I speak to some people, for example, with breast cancer, and it's really their actions which help them to detect the cancer early, and that's really important too. So we'll touch on that a little bit too.
So just in drawing to a close here, we for this episode, I guess we've got a few of the basics down for the podcast coming up, but if you want to get the bigger picture, tune into this podcast with Dr. Maggie Cooper.
You can find us on Twitter at BigPicPod. We've also got a page on Facebook which is called The Bigger Picture Podcast. Thanks to Peter for helping me introduce the podcast to you, and I hope that you'll join me for the first episode in April.